Good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here today for this Hooked on History lecture series. We have a special person, Sheila Howard, who is the branch manager. Sheila, stand up and raise your hand so they'll know you. Speak to Sheila and tell her how wonderful they are and all that as you leave. So a special thanks to First Bank for sponsoring this program, Hooked on History. Please convey your thanks to them when you go by there and talk to them. Uh, One of the interesting things that has happened today is it raining and storming, and we didn't expect a good crowd. But Wayne, apparently they heard your reputation, and they're here to see that you can live up to it. So just hang tough. Wayne has loved and shared his lover's quarrel with Alabama for 82 years. He's lived in Sheffield and Gadsden and Birmingham and Anniston and Dothan. That's kind of like a gypsy. And in Auburn, he taught at Sanford for 12 years, and he was at Auburn for 28 years. He is now the Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at Auburn. He has had over 6,000 students, including 68 master's and PhD graduates. He served as the president of the Auburn history program for a number of years there. And one of the interesting things is he has received numerous awards for his 16 books. He belongs to the Alabama Academy of Honor. His most cherished awards would be the Hugo Black Award and the C. Van Woodard Award for Fellowship of Southern Writers and the Governor's Award for the Arts. He was a visiting professor in Hong Kong. He was in England and in Austria, Czechoslovakia, the People's Republic of China. He and Darty were in China teaching for a period of months there. And so he's really moved around and he's well known. So please, if you haven't already done so, turn off your cell phones. And let me tell you one interesting story. And this is probably the most important thing I'll tell you. 24 years ago, we adopted Wayne as our favorite son. It was in a brown bag like this. We were down at the museum, and he's done real well. The way I keep up with it is he was adopted here after Jesse Ventura was elected governor of Minnesota. I don't know what happened to Jesse in the meantime. I think that just shows that the academic world is tougher than the political world, and thank God for that. So Wayne, 24 years ago, you were adopted, so welcome home, son.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you. That was wonderful. Well, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. She's in my Sunday school class. I teach class, but Donna is the secretary of the class. And at age 46, Donna's husband died of a heart attack, and he was in charge of academic counseling for the athletic program at Auburn University. And of course, I lost my wife 3 years ago. And in the meantime, my wife and Donna and I had become such close friends that we became the godparents of her 3 daughters, who are just absolutely brilliant, 2 in Los Angeles now and 1 in Houston. And so I broached the idea to Donna that after 25 years of teaching Spanish at Opelika High School and in Akron, Ohio, where she comes from, that she might be interested in maybe something different after 25 years of being in the presence of 17 and 18-year-olds. And I said, how would you like to drive me from New York City to St. Francisville, Louisiana for 7 months in a book tour? And I mean, it was like I had said, how would you like for me to give you $1 billion? And she said, I think it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with being tired of 16, 17-year-old kids trying to learn Spanish in Opelika. But on the way over here today, I told Donna, of all the places I have lectured, in all the places in the world in which I have lectured, Sylacauga, Alabama. And this amazing event that Ted and Shirley and others put together is my favorite place to lecture. And it's partly because Darty and her mother and father were from Sylacauga. Her father and mother are buried over in this cemetery. Her grandfather and grandmother are buried up on the hill in the old cemetery. And so every time I come in, I think, I really ought to tell people I want to be buried in Sylacauga when I die. But I'm going to ask Donna to stand up because Donna, she doesn't like this, I'm sure, but Donna is just just one of the finest people I know. Do you remember when you met your best friend? Do you remember how old your best friend was when you met your best friend? Do you remember whether your best friend lived in Sylacauga or up in the hills or in Alexander City? Do you remember what first attracted you to your best friend? Something you had in common, something about their mannerisms, whether you were in the same church. And if you can get a visual image of that person, your best friend, and how you met your best friend and the relationship of that best friend, you will understand what I'm going to talk to you about today. Because if you met your best friend when your best friend was 80 years old, not when you were a child playing together, not when she or he was a teenager, not when that person was in college with you, not when that person was courting you, but a best friend you made at 80 years old, a best friend who'd lived in New York City almost all of her life. Not because she had to live in New York City, but because she didn't want to live in Alabama, and particularly not Monroeville, Alabama. She didn't want to live in any small town in Alabama. She wanted to live in a big city that was exciting and where literature was deeply valued. And the only reason she came back to Alabama was because she had a stroke. And she had a stroke, and she was for 3 weeks in Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. And fortunately, an Alabama writer and good friend of hers who had found her after she had fallen off the bed and been in the floor almost for 24 hours, and got her to Mount Sinai, thought if I put her in Mount Sinai under the name Harper Lee, it is going to be a national story. And so she put her in the hospital under her real name, Nell Lee, not Nell Harper Lee. And no one ever found out, no reporter ever found out who she was. And then one morning, Tom Carruthers, who was head of probably Birmingham's most prestigious law firm and one of its most brilliant attorneys, called me and said, Wayne, there's something you and Darty need to know. Harper Lee had a stroke, and Harper Lee has been moved to Lakeshore Rehab in Homewood, Alabama, and she has a fake name. And she's going to be here a long time because she was 24 hours between the stroke and the time that she was found. And she's probably not going to be able to ever walk again. So, and she's really depressed. And he said, I'm just calling a handful of people and telling them about her and what has happened to her. And if you and Darty can come to visit her, I'm sure the family would really appreciate it. My mother was a widow living in Pinson, Alabama, just north of Birmingham. And so we were up there about every month to visit my mother. And on the way back, we started visiting Harper. The first time we visited Harper, I know she was really depressed, really unhappy, as you can imagine. And so I told Darty, well, we've got this brand new CD player. And so why don't we bring the CD player and some CDs? And she said, well, which ones we're going to bring? And I said, well, I know Harper's reputation enough to know literature would be great. And I just happened to have a CD of a professional recorder who was reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and Jane Austen was her favorite writer. And also had a wonderful British comedian named John Cleese reading C.S. Lewis's hilarious short story, Screwtape Letters. And I also had our dear friend Eudora Welty, before she died, reading her own short story, Why I Live at the P.O., the post office. And so we brought those 3 CDs to her, and the next time we came, she said, Wayne, I don't know how I could have gotten through this without those 3 CDs. She said, I laugh, I cry. They're just absolutely wonderful. So what I'm going to tell you about is a friendship that was born in a CD player, 3 CDs, and a stroke. Otherwise, this story would have never happened. Let me entirely shift gears here. And I'm going to just tell you a whole series of one-liners. Harper Lee was not a marble lady. She was never a marble lady. She was an authentic Alabama woman. Now, you make out of that what you please to make out of that. And if you're a Danish Southern Belle, you just be perfectly content to be a Danish Southern Belle. Harper Lee was not a Danish Southern Belle. Harper Lee was not neurotic or a loner or a recluse who rejected social relationships. But she was, like my wife, intensely private. I'm neither neurotic nor intensely private, as you probably know. Harper Lee was not a fan of Monroeville, Alabama, where she was born. And like a lot of young women born in towns the size of Monroeville, they can't wait till they get out and go someplace else. Harper Lee was a University of Alabama fan, even though she never had an academic degree from the University of Alabama. She has honorary degrees, but not an academic degree. She did not care for Auburn University, despite the fact that her brother went to Auburn University, her sister went to Auburn University, her nephew went to Auburn University. As a matter of fact, as I constantly told her during football season when we visited, I said, Nell, you know, God really got you into the wrong cradle. You should have been in the Auburn cradle, and how God made a mistake and dropped you in the Alabama cradle, I don't know, because you got no connections to Alabama and all kind of connections to Auburn. This led to long conversations that were hilariously funny, but I won't repeat some of the language in them. She was a great fan of Bear Bryant, incidentally, her favorite coach. She was invited to a testimonial dinner at the most beautiful old hotel in New York City. And she was so nervous that she actually got a taxi, which was unprecedented because she was so cheap. She either took the subway or took a bus or just walked. And when she walked to the elevator for this grand dinner the University of Alabama was having in honor of Bear Bryant, and she's scared to death and she's nervous as she can be, and the elevator door opens, and there is Bear Bryant and Mary Harmon, the only 2 people on the elevator. And the elevator door is open, and she looks, and there they are. And she's so shocked, she doesn't know what to say. And all of a sudden, in that raspy voice of Bear Bryant, she said, well, Mary Harmon, Harper Lee's here. Now we can get this thing started. Harper Lee was a prodigious reader of the Bible, the King James Bible, the only Bible, she said, that is the real Bible. She said it contains the greatest language in English in the history of languages. And I mean, she didn't have any other translation. I said, there are better translations that you can understand better. And she said, I understand the King James as well as I ever want to understand anything in the Bible. She was religious, but not the way Darty and I were religious. She was religious in her own way, but profoundly religious. Now, you must remember, we knew her after she'd had a stroke. She was 81 years old, and she lived almost to 90. And so maybe you become a little bit more religious in a situation like that. But when we knew her, she was deeply religious in her own way. Harper Lee's favorite author was Jane Austen. Her next favorite author was C.S. Lewis. And when she died, she had the complete works of C.S. Lewis on an ottoman in her assisted living facility. And she was reading C.S. Lewis too. And so this is our friendship, kind of complicated. Complicated by the time when we met her, the physical circumstances of her life, the fact that she didn't want a lot of people to visit, that we were picked by Tom Carruthers to be two who were told about this. And then I had retired, and she and Darty sort of fell in love with each other. And so I was the driver who got Darty down there and the one who provoked her stories. So here's a story. It's a story from the new book, Afternoons with Harper Lee. And there's a reason why I picked this story. In 1963, at the peak of her fame, a reporter asked Nell if the success of the novel and the movie To Kill a Mockingbird will spoil Harper Lee. She replied with a quip she often used at press conferences. She's too old. Well, she was 37. Not exactly too old to be spoiled by popularity. Her answer was disingenuous, of course. She had plenty of time left. The reporter's follow-up question was, what is your next book going to be about? And she said, I'm scared. But now, I never asked her what she meant by that. She could have meant popularity when you're a very private person. I mean, when you're an intensely private person and all of a sudden you want to Pulitzer Prize, and as I write at the coda, the last page of the book, in December of last year, the New York Times Book Review section completed a survey. It was 125 years old, and they said, we want all the readers of the New York Times Book Review section to tell us their favorite book published in the last 125 years. Responses from 67 nations where readers read the New York Times Book Review section, plus tens of thousands of American readers. By a landslide, the world's most famous author and the most famous book was Harper Lee and To Kill a Mockingbird, December of last year. So, for those of you who wonder why she never wrote a book, if you win the Pulitzer Prize with your first book and you're intensely private, why write another book? And the other book she wrote was a book written before To Kill a Mockingbird called Go Set a Watchman from the Bible. And she never wrote anything else. We never really learned what drew Harper Lee to Willie Maxwell and the Willie Maxwell murder case. Although in some strange and undefinable way, crime and violence have always occupied the fringes of human conduct and the center of human curiosity. Murder. Why? How? That's the reason murder mysteries are the best-selling kind of pulp fiction in America. Her beloved King James Bible, when you think about it, contains an awful lot of violence and crime. And her favorite play was King Lear. If you've not seen it or read it, there's a lot of crime and violence in King Lear. Even in childhood, she was drawn to novels about that subject. Part of the attraction of Truman Capote's invitation to join him in Garden City, Kansas, after the Clutter murders. and the publication later by him of In Cold Blood, was to have her do all the research for the book, which is one of the most chilling books I have ever read. A few years later, while Truman exulted in the fame of In Cold Blood, a lawyer friend of mine began to send her documents about a mysterious killing in Alexander City, Alabama. Nell went through the clippings and the documents and was soon bound for Alexander City, Alabama, where her niece owned a motel and where she stayed for many months. The small county seat of Tallapoosa County, as you know, is a sort of borderline Appalachian county, the center for the first major gold rush in American history, a really interesting town. The Reverend Willie Maxwell was at the center of the story, handsome African-American standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, physically imposing, former Marine, but he'd served in a really interesting part of the Marine Corps. It was the chemical division, and he had been trained in compounds that could kill you without leaving a single trace. When you really want to get rid of somebody and you don't want any evidence, he knew how to do it. Maxwell was the sort of man that most local whites in Alexander City and Sylacauga really respected. He owned his own pulpwood business. He hired African-American workers to cut down trees and cut the trees and put the logs on his truck, carry them off. And he was also a bivocational Baptist preacher. Now, for those of you who are not Baptist, the average Baptist church has less than 100 members. Most Baptist churches in Alabama are rural. So whether it's white or black, they don't really have enough money to pay a full-time salary to a preacher. And so almost all the pastors are bivocational, including many of my friends growing up and many of my classmates at Howard College. Bivocational pastors who had to do something else, teach school or something else, because they wouldn't make enough pastoring the church. And so that was the situation with Maxwell. So he has this business and he has this church. And something else you need to know about the sociology of religion, and especially in the South. Most members of Baptist churches are female. I'm sure females have an explanation of why that is true. The only thing I know is it is true, and almost every church in which I've ever preached has had a majority of female members. And as a result of that, many of these female members, whether single or married, sort of have a fascination by somebody who counsels them, baptizes them, talks to them, pays attention to them. And so here is this handsome, tall, former Marine, prosperous, well-dressed, charismatic preacher man. And then in 1968, Maxwell's wife, Mary Lou, was found dead in what seemed to be like a car accident. But as the incident unfolded, not so much like a car accident, like something that was staged. And Willie Maxwell was charged with murder. Now here you're going to hear why I love Alexander City and Sylacauga so much, because I know so many people here. And Tom Radney was a good friend of mine, an attorney, and he was hired by the insurance companies. He was hired by Willie Maxwell to defend him. And then John Denson, one of my good friends in Auburn, who was on the board of trustees at Auburn University and still is a good friend. And he was representing the insurance companies. Now, the way these insurance companies work, and the reason I know this is because my dad, at one stage of his peripatetic life, sold insurance. And this insurance in Sheffield, Alabama, was designed for working class people, which meant he had, every week, he went around to every house where someone had taken out this burial insurance or this life insurance, and they would pay him because you couldn't allow it to be done every 6 months because the people didn't have that kind of money. So Dad would collect a quarter or a dime or 19 cents or 27 cents from each person on these streets where he walked. And that's the way these insurance companies sold insurance, especially to African Americans who did not have much money. And so he's taken out these insurance policies, and Mary Lou is found dead. And Tom Radney was his attorney, representing him in the murder case. Tom was charming, if you knew him, well-liked in Coosa and Tallapoosa counties, which he represented in the state legislature, and brilliant in and out of court. When outside corporate attorneys came to Alexander City or Sylacauga to match their skills against Tom Radney, they left town with their reputations besmirched because he just killed them, because he knew how to try a case in front of an audience of people like you. And they were outsiders, and they didn't know because they were representing big insurance companies from outside of town. Maxwell's next-door neighbor was Dorcas Anderson, and she was scheduled to be the state's star witness. She is going to testify against Maxwell, and she's going to testify, according to my friend in Auburn, that his wife was really upset by all the calls from women late at night and how he would disappear and about his general conduct, and that he was not the same man in their house as he was when he was at the church or when he was wandering around Alexander City. And so she was going to be the star witness testifying against him and how much his wife feared him and how violent he was, right up until the time when she switched her testimony. And instead of testifying against him, she testified for him. This strange conduct was very successful as far as Radney and Beneficial Standard Life Insurance Company was concerned, because that meant they had to pay out this money. Such insurance companies routinely took these small insurance policies out. And as I say, my dad did this, but then most of the insurance companies were not having to deal with a man who killed his wife or wives. Not only was Tom Rodney my friend, but so was John Denson, an attorney from Opelika, Alabama, a member of the Board of Trustees at Auburn University, a man that I got to know very well. And John Denson told me the other side of this story from Tom Radney. Tom Radney is representing Maxwell. John Denson is representing the insurance companies who are trying not to pay this because they think something is really, really rotten in Denmark. Denson's father, as a sidebar, had served with Harper Lee's father in the Alabama legislature in the 1920s. And he even showed me a book about the 1927 Alabama legislature. And his father was in one picture, and Harper Lee's father was in the picture right next to him, and they were good friends. While preparing for the defense of Beneficial Standard, John Denson had interviewed Dorcas Anderson, woman next door. She told him that Maxwell's wife was terrified of him, that unidentified women called the house at night all the time. Maxwell would leave and go see them. Maxwell left that night, the night of his wife's accident, in plenty of time to have committed the murder and gotten home. After Tom Radney won Maxwell's case against Beneficial Standard, the insurance company had to pay all these policies. Maxwell walked over to John Denson, my friend from Opelika, put a hand on his shoulder, and he said, "Brother Denson, you said some awfully mean things about me in this trial, but I've asked the Lord to forgive you, and he said he would. And I do too. Just go out and sin no more." John said it was the most chilling conversation he'd ever had. Maxwell's arrogance was unsettling, and when the insurance company continued, if you can believe this, to write policies for other relatives who also mysteriously died, Denson said, "I've had enough of representing insurance companies, and I'm not getting involved with that man anymore." A year after Maxwell's acquittal for murder, he and Dorcas Anderson, who had been the key star witness until she was not the key star witness, married. Amazingly, Other Maxwell relatives, including Historicus Anderson, mysteriously continued to die. Amazingly, the insurance company continued to write policies, but then had to go to court, and they had to pay the policies because no one could find anything wrong. And when subsequently contacted by insurance companies foolish enough to consider writing policies to the Reverend Maxwell, John Denson said, "I'm not handling any more cases involving Maxwell." As you probably know, Maxwell died as he lived, following 5 mysterious deaths, all involving insurance policies taken out by these insurance companies for pennies a week. Finally, a family friend of one of those killed, Robert Louis Burns, murdered Maxwell in front of 300 people in a funeral home chapel on June 18, 1977. Given that there were 300 witnesses, the verdict in Burns' subsequent murder trial in Alexander City seemed a foregone conclusion. Have you ever known a murder where there were 300 witnesses? Well, this one was such a murder. But such an assumption reckoned without the skill of Burns' attorney, Tom Radney, who may have been even better at voodoo with a Tallapoosa County grand jury than Willie Maxwell was with a strangled chicken hung to his porch. Still, a lawyer defending a man for murder of a man whom he had once defended for murder, even in Alexander City, was really strange. A young reporter, later with the Montgomery Advertiser, named Jim Earnhardt, called me one day and said, "Have you heard about these murders?" And I said, "I heard about them, and they're really weird." He said, "You can't believe how weird they are." He said, the day Burns shot Maxwell in the back of the head, he was sitting on the second row. Maxwell was right in front of him, mourning his wife. And he put the gun right to his head and bang. And my friend Jim Earnhardt covered the story. Years later, he recalled the pandemonium to me of the funeral home chapel that day. People trampled each other trying to get out the door. Some people couldn't wait to get out of the door because there were so many people rushing to the door, so they tried. It was a hot day and the windows were up, so they tried to get out the windows. And some people were so large they got stuck in the windows, and there were people pushing them from the back, trying to get them out of the window because they couldn't get out the door. And here was this murderer with a gun. Of course, he was not interested in killing any of them. Earnhardt described his interview then with a member of the all-white jury that voted to acquit Burns. And Earnhardt interviewed one of the jurors after the acquittal, and he said, "I don't know how you could find someone not guilty of shooting an unarmed Baptist preacher sitting on a pew in a chapel with 300 witnesses, and you found him not guilty?" To which the working class, Alabama, white, common sense about the nature of justice juror said, "Some people just ought to be shot." If that is not the greatest one-liner about a murder you've ever heard, in terms of acquitting the person who murdered the murderer, I have never heard a better line. Nell Harper Reed in New York City, after the publication of To Kill a Mockingbird, was thinking, well, I've been to Garden City, Kansas with Truman, and I've read this spellbinding great novel, In Cold Blood, and what am I going to do next? She was soon on her way to Alexander City, Alabama, to write a story. But as soon as she arrived in Alexander City, she realized, this is not Garden City, Kansas. By chance, Nell's off at Nice on this hotel, so she had a place to stay. She interviewed Burns, the murderer of the murderer. She interviewed Tom Radney, who proved a charming and cooperative source for her. The Radneys found Nell to be witty, charming, sociable, and a quick study about legal matters because, of course, she had been in law school briefly at the University of Alabama. After Nell returned to New York, Rodney grew impatient as time passed, and he received no copies of the book that she was going to write. Nell finally sent him 4 pages, and he said they were spellbinding, but there was never any more book. One Sunday afternoon, while Darty and I were visiting Louise Connor in Eufaula, we were sharing stories about translations of Mockingbird when she asked us if we would like to see 40 different copies of Mockingbird in 40 different languages. And we said, well, of course. And she took us back to her bedroom, and there they were, shelved away. And as we walked back to the porch where we normally sat and talked, I said, you know, there's a rumor that Harper Lee really wrote another book about this murder in Alexander City, Alabama. And she said, oh, yes. And she stopped us, and she pointed to the table in her dining room, and she said, that's where she wrote The Reverend. And I was so shocked that I really didn't ask, well, did she finish The Reverend? What did she do with The Reverend? Is The Reverend still around? Is that book still here? Louis said, well, Nell wrote The Reverend, sitting here. We asked no questions about the fate of the manuscript, whether Nell still had it, whether she had completed it, whether it was in New York with her, whether it was in Monroe, whether it was going to be published. Harper Whitley was still alive. She was still in good health. We had met her only once, and we thought questions about an unknown manuscript would have been entirely presumptuous. What business do I have mentioning all this stuff that I knew about? Even worse, if I kept asking about Harper Lee, Louise Connor, who was one of the most fascinating women I have ever known, the middle of the 3 sisters, would think, well, I'm only interested in Harper Lee. I'm not interested in her. And we were really interested in her. She was wonderful. 4 decades later, on April 5th, 2015, sitting at assisted living, the Meadows, Nell began to spin a story. The Maxwell murders, the 3 wives, the name of the killer, even the name of the reporter who covered the case. That conversation resulted from the most serendipitous set of circumstances. I just completed a long telephone call with a physician in Eufaula, where her sister Louise Connor lived. His son was a member of the Pilgrim Sunday School class, which Donna is a member of, and he had told me that his father wanted to talk with me. And I said, where does your father live? He said, Eufaula. So I gave him my telephone number, and on April 19th, his father called 2 weeks before our conversation about the Maxwell case with Nell. The good doctor explained that Louise Connor was one of his patients and had called to ask permission for Harper Lee to contact him about some neurological problems. He assumed that the fiercely private novelist was experiencing personal neurological problems, which made sense. She calls her sister and says, do you know a neurologist I could talk to who would not reveal that I've talked to him because I don't want anybody to know about this? So it sounds like she has neurological problems. And so the doctor, father of my Sunday school member, told him all about this, and Nell called, and they had a long conversation, not about her own health, but the effect of certain chemicals on the brain. Which ones could be lethal, not traced? Mystified by the entire conversation, the doctor in Eufaula finally concluded she must be working on a book. She must be writing a book that has something to do about neurology. A few years later, I speculated about various reasons why her book, if completed, was never published. Coincidentally, an Auburn graduate student who lived in rural Tallapoosa County had enrolled in my Southern history class. We became really good friends, and she was fairly near my age and Darty's. And she told me, after writing many fine local history books about Tallapoosa County, that she was working on a new book. And I said, well, what's your new book? And she said, The Maxwell Murders. I said, wow, I mean, that is really something. Not long after we talked about that, she said that she had dropped that project. She was aware of rumors that Harper Lee had written a novel about the bizarre events, and the next time we talked, she said the Reverend Maxwell's relatives were not only uncooperating, they were menacing. One of them lived across a rural road from her in Tallapoosa County, had a fierce guard dog with only a light restraint of fence. And the woman came over one day and said, something really bad is going to happen to you if you continue to meddle in the Maxwell family. The second time we hesitantly mentioned the Maxwell case to Nell Harper Lee, she was entirely unresponsive. On the way home, Darty said, you know, I think her memory problem consists less of what she has forgotten than of what she still remembers. Years later, we asked Nell's executor, Tanya Carter, attorney for the Harper Lee estate in Monroeville, about that missing manuscript, assuming she might know its fate. She told us that while Ellis was still heading the law firm, a doctoral student writing a dissertation about Harper Lee had come to Monroeville and asked about rumors he had heard about a novel she had written based on the Maxwell case. According to Tanya, Alice Lee reached up in her bookcase, pulled down the manuscript, gave it to him on the condition that he returned the manuscript after he had finished his doctoral dissertation. He never returned the manuscript. And somehow, when this book is published, I really hope I'm going to get a letter from some English professor, or perhaps from some contrite former graduate student who never finished his dissertation or returned that book, which says that in light of the importance of this woman and the interest in the Maxwell case, I'm going to send that manuscript back to where it belongs, to Monroe. Thank you. We have some time. So
Do you feel like taking a few questions?
I feel like taking some questions, although I've told you everything I know. But
For the purpose of our recording, if you want to ask a question, do you mind repeating it in your
Sure.
microphone, Dr. Flynt, so we get it on tape?
if I can hear it, I'm 82 years old and my hearing's not as good as it once was. I just look young. First question is always the hard one. We got a couple of lawyers in the audience, so I'm surprised we have not immediately had a question from one of them.
You genuinely liked and loved Harper Lee, didn't you?
I genuinely liked and loved Harper Lee. She was the feistiest woman I have ever seen in my life. She was private to the point of unreasonableness. I did something that most people didn't do with Harper Lee. I didn't defer to her. And of course, most of you knew Darty. Darty wouldn't have deferred to God. Darty was who Darty was. And they got along. I mean, in fact, this book is as much about Darty as it is about Nell. And I used to say they conspired against me by phone before we went down there and then fed off each other to insult and humiliate me. And some great one-liners, some of the greatest one-liners I've ever heard. One day, Nell was telling some fascinating story, and we had by then been friends for a decade. And when she finished the story, I said, Nell, that's just absolutely the most wonderful story I believe I've ever heard. And I was sitting, because she was completely deaf in one ear, and almost deaf in the other. And so you had to get 6 inches away from her right ear, 6 to 10 inches, in order for her to hear you anything. And then you shouted. So our conversations resulted in me being so hoarse for the next week I couldn't lecture in my classes because I was shouting at her at the top of my voice, right at her right ear. Darty was getting as far away as she could in the little assisted living to get away from the shouting. And she said something so funny that I just reached over, sort of impromptu, and kissed her on the cheek. And then I immediately realized what I had done, invading her space. And I thought, oh, Lord, this is the end of a friendship as I'm withdrawing. And she looked up and said, you know, I sort of like being kissed by a man with a mustache. And that made it even worse. Then I just blushed. I turned red as a beet. And, you know, those of you who knew Darty knew what a wonderful sense of humor she had. All of a sudden, there's just nothing but silence. I don't know what to say. Nels had her say. Darty's sitting there grinning like a Cheshire cat. And she said, you know, being kissed by a man with a mustache is like having to go through the brambles to get to a picnic. Once you get there, it's lots of fun. At which point, if I could have disappeared into the floor, if I'd ever prayed, God, just take me up, it was at that moment. I thought Nell was going to fall out of the wheelchair. She was laughing so hard. And that's the kind of relationship we had. And, you know, she was fonder of women than she was men. And she was very distrustful of me because I was a writer and because almost all other writers were trying to write about her life. And she said, Wayne, I don't want you ever to write about my life while I'm alive. And I said, Nell, I would never write about you. But after Darty died in February of 2000, and the first COVID case was on the 19th of February in Seattle, where my son lives. And, you know, my Sunday school class shut down, church was closed. I'm lonely, grieving, and I decided, well, if you're ever going to write this story, and we had 200 pages of notes, because we'd always made, you know, this is a really important woman, and people need to know what she's like. Not the rumors, but what she was really like. And we had done this primarily because we felt we would leave these to an archives, and then people would say, well, that's the real Harper Lee, not the mythology. And, you know, Darty said, well, you know, Wayne, you want to write a book about who she is after she dies. And so I spent 18 months in solitude, which I don't recommend. That's not good for mental health to do that. But after all, what else are you going to do? And so that's what I did. And that's a book. And this is not a marble lady. And if you think she's perfect, I would urge you not to read this because she was not perfect. But man, was she fascinating. And I always thought if you were ever introduced Harper Lee and somebody asked you what she was like, there'd be a lot of disparate answers because it depended on who you were. And if you invaded her space, you would not like her because she would tell you exactly where you could go. And she could tell you the proper route to get there, too. Other question? Yes, sir.
I guess you spent some time with her sister.
Louise, and I did not spend as much time with Miss Alice. But then you've got to remember, Miss Alice died at 103. And Miss Alice was 90 some odd years old when we first met her. And she was still practicing law. And all this actually began because, as you know, I'm a Baptist preacher. Despite what prejudices you may have in that regard, I'm a Baptist preacher. And I was invited by Miss Alice, curiously enough, to speak to the South Alabama, West Florida Methodist Conference because she was the first woman ever elected to be head of the South Alabama, West Florida Conference. And she was very interested in having programs for women. So she called me one day and she said, I wish Darty were here because she could mimic her voice perfectly because she had some tremor problems. And so the conversation went something like, Wayne, would you come to our Methodist women's program and talk about the Bible and race? And I said, Miss Alice, I'd be glad to. And so I go to the meeting. Well, Louise Connor, her sister's there, who's sort of the pillar of the Methodist Church in Eufaula, and Miss Alice, who is the pillar of Monroeville Methodist Church, and even taught the men's Bible class, which I've always thought was really funny. But she knew more about the Bible than probably any of the men in the church, including the pastor. And so I spoke about the Bible and race. And Louise Connor, after I spoke, said, you know, I just really liked that, and I love the Bible, and I wonder if you come and visit me sometime. And I said, Louise, do you really want Darty and me to come visit you, or are you just talking Southern? You know, come see me sometime. No, I really didn't mean that. And so Louise laughed, and she said, no. She said, my husband just died, and he was an Auburn grad. I was at Auburn. And she said, I would just love it if he would come. So after I taught my Sunday school class, Darty and I started going down there once a month. After Sunday school, and of course she'd pick up an hour because, you know, they're on the Eastern Standard Time. And I would drive her to we would drive her to her favorite soul food restaurant over in Lumpkin, Georgia, and spend the afternoon on her front porch talking. And of course she talks about her mother, her father, her sister, but not so much about her sister because she really respected her sister's privacy, but she taught a lot about Miss Alice. Miss Alice was so brilliant that when she turned 100, she had a driver then, and the driver, she was still practicing law, and the driver brought her to assisted living, Wilnell was, and when she came in the door with her walking cane, she said, I knew you were here because I saw your 43 tag on your car. I said, Miss Alice, you never lived in Lee County. You live in Montgomery County and Jefferson County and Monroe County. And I said, how do you know that Lee County has a prefix of 43? She said, Wayne, I have insomnia, and when I can't sleep, I repeat all the county prefixes in order, starting with Autauga, and I never get to Winston County because I'm always asleep by then. She also could name all the presidents forward and backward, and all the vice presidents forward and backward at 100 years old. And you know, she had a rapid decline at 101, and she died in assisted living, but she was still telling stories 6 months before she died. There's a Gaillard family, a famous family of writers, and they live a long time, and they're from Monroe County. And Alice once told me a story. She said, you know what the saying is in Monroe County? I said, no, ma'am, I don't. And she said, they say to men, never marry a Gaillard woman because they live forever. And our friendship with Alice was not as close as with Louise because we would, once a month for 10 years, we took Louise to lunch, and she spun all the stories. And in fact, she said one day we were there, and she said, do you mind if we wait a little longer to go to Lumpkin, Georgia for lunch? I said, no, ma'am, we're on your time. She said, well, you know, I really am fond. The whole family was fond of golf, and by ranking, her brother Ed was the athlete in the family. He was the best golfer. Nell was the second best golfer. Her father, Coleman Coley Lee, was the next best golfer, and it ranked on down with the other sisters. And Louise said, I just love golf. And this is the British Open, and it's going into overtime and whatever they call it. And if you don't mind, I'd like to watch the rest of that. And so we watched the rest of it, and then we were driving over in the car, and she was sitting beside me, and Dory was in the back seat. And she said, "Wayne, you know anything about golf?" I said, "I know nothing about golf." She said, "Well, you know, at the British Open, they have a bagpipe, and they play Amazing Grace on the bagpipe." And she said, "When I die, I want you to be sure that they find a bagpiper who plays Amazing Grace on the bagpipe at my funeral." And there was a long pause, and I'm thinking, I don't really want that responsibility, Louis. And because I don't know any bagpipers at all. They're kind of rare in Auburn. I don't know that. And she said, "Wayne, I won't know whether I'm in heaven or at the British Open, and it won't make any difference."
Do we have any more questions? Okay. Dr. Flynt, thank you so much for allowing us to be part of kicking off your book tour. I think the thing that just strikes me so much is we're all so protective of our time because it's one of our greatest resources. And to meet somebody like you, that you and Doherty gave so much time to other people, that you invested so much of your personal time.
I don't give this much time to other people except in Silicaga.
Well, we're grateful, and we thank you so much. And I want to let you know, Dr. Flynn is going to be selling books across the hall. So if you go out this door and into the Avondale room, we have a table set up there. He'll be over there signing books, and you can stop and speak with him. And again, I want to tell you that people like Dr. Flynt come to Silicaga because of people like Dr. Shirley Spears. She calls, she asks them to come, and they know that you're going to show up. So if he had known this crowd was going to be 5 people today, I know Dr. Flynt, he would have came anyway, but he knew when he came to Silicaga that he was going to get to see you. So thank you so much for coming out and supporting these programs. And I also want to thank, too, Sheila Howard again for being here from First Bank of Alabama, because without the bank's support, we could not do things like this. And I also want to thank the hospital for these great cookies that you got to have. And again, I always want to thank Dr. Shirley Spears with the Comer Foundation for booking these programs and taking the time to get quality people like Dr. Wayne Flynt here. Thank you so much. You are a treasure, and we're excited about what your book tour and what's going to come for you.
Well, I'm expecting you to continue to invite me until I'm 100.
We will. We will. Thank you all so much for coming today. Don't forget, next week we have David Lutzko. He is the chair of history at Auburn University. He's going to be here to do a program on hot rodding. And if you came to his program a couple of years ago, he did one on junkyards that was fascinating. So he's a great presenter, and we hope to see you again next week.